Alors, nous avons comme objectif dans le projet d'avoir des livrables tangibles en termes de solutions. Et vous voyez un petit peu la complexité de devoir jongler avec des paramètres de droit, d'économie, de paramètres biophysiques, d'écologie. Donc, on a fait appel à une gymnaste intellectuelle, Sylvia Wood. Et dans l'activité 3.5, en fait, les capacités de géographe et de cartographe de Sylvia, comme vous le montrera, elles permettent d'intégrer ces différents paramètres. Donc, il y a vraiment une dimension intrigatrice dans son travail. Donc, je te laisse la parole à la dernière présentatrice de la journée. Merci.
Merci, Jérôme. Et merci à vous de rester jusqu'à la fin aujourd'hui. Je sais que c'était une journée assez longue. Je vais présenter aujourd'hui en anglais, mais je suis contente de prendre des questions en anglais et en français. So, as Jérôme mentioned, one of my jobs is to try to bring together some of the themes that we've already been talking about reducing nitrogen and phosphorus going into our waterways, about these provisions of ecosystem services and how do we achieve them. And one of the ways that we're going to try to do that is to talk about how we can use agro-environmental practices in our landscapes to try to target where these things should be going in to develop the most effective and efficient approaches to addressing these problems. And so today I'm going to talk to you about how we can use spatially explicit modeling tools to help us try to bring all these things together into one plan. So I don't need to remind you that in Quebec we've been going through an agricultural intensification. Oh no, please can you stay here? Okay. Okay, parfait. C'est mieux? Okay. That in Quebec, we've been going through an agricultural transition, and we've been intensifying, so many small farms have been amalgamated into much smaller farms, or sorry, the other way around. Much smaller farms have been amalgamated into much larger farms, and we've moved to concentrating on a very few crops towards corn and soy, as well as we've increased our focus on livestock production. And this has come with a number of environmental problems. We've simplified our landscapes, we've lost parts of our forests and the biodiversity in these agricultural landscapes, and we're degrading the water quality. And today that's what we've been talking about, is how this has been leading to cyanobacterial blooms. And so one of our projects at the lab is to really try to look at what are the practices we already have at hand, the types of programs and tools we could be using to try to address these problems. And so we actually, within the current agricultural paradigm, we have a number of tools that we're thinking about using. So many of these are familiar to you all. So riparian buffers, intercropping, cover crops, as well as more technical solutions like controlled drainage or tillage management practices. And these can be very useful, but each one is specific to the type of problem that it's trying to address. And so we need to be really careful about which types of things we put where on landscapes to make sure that the solution we're proposing is actually addressing the problem that we're trying to fix. And so there's a need to actually try to make sure that we're matching these. But we also need to make sure that we're matching them to the right places in the landscape. Not everywhere in the landscape is causing the types of water quality problems that we're seeing. So there might be a farmer who's doing fairly good practices and maybe doesn't really need to adopt these. Or he's not very close to a water source, and so his contribution is quite minimal. And so we need to be taking in these spatial dynamics into consideration when we're trying to think about how to build programs and projects that are actually going to be effective and cost efficient. And as I just mentioned, we live in a world of budgets. The farmer has a budget, how much he's willing to pay to put in a new practice. But the programs we also were talking about, Prime Vert and ALUS, they also have budgets, and so they're looking to have the biggest bang for buck. And so we need to think about what are the costs of implementing each of these practices, both today, the actual putting it in, but how much is also going to cost us to maintain those on the land. So a cover crop you have to actually plant every year, controlled drainage you put in once. And so we're looking at trying to understand what would a potentially ecologically, economically efficient program potentially look like in the Baie-Missisquoi watershed. And so this is one that straddles the US border and the main tributaries flow into Lake Champlain. And so this is where a lot of the nutrients are coming that are causing the cyanobacterial blooms that we've been talking about. And it's also an area that's received a lot of support from the government programs of Prime Vert recently. And so we know that there is an effort to try to put these practices into place. But we don't actually know where they're going into place right now. That's not information we have access to. And so we have to move sort of to the hypothetical and use models to try to help us understand where we should be doing these things. And so right now I'm working with a colleague of mine, Caroline Simard, to try to use two different spatial modeling tools to help us target where the types of practices we want to put in will be most efficient. And so RIOS is a resource investment optimization system, which tries to spatially optimize where to put a practice in based on the type of ecosystem service provision it's going to be able to provide at the end of the day. And so to run the model, you have to feed it with a number of different environmental practices that you're considering, the efficiency of each of those practices, sort of across a gradient of the landscape, where they're allowed to be put in a budget. And it will use an algorithm to try to identify which combinations of practices across the landscape are going to result in the best outcome for environmental services. And so we ran this, and we were optimizing for water quality. And so our objective in the modeling framework was to try to reduce our sediment, our phosphorus, and our nutrient exports into the system. And so we picked 5 different land management practices that the model was able to apply anywhere in the landscape. And those were cover crops, controlled drainage, and 3 different buffer sizes. Each of those also had a spatial constraint associated with them, so you can only put a buffer along a river. Fairly intuitive. And we also wanted to see how should we prioritize? Even if we know we have a budget, where do we go first? You know, it's going to take a long time to roll these types of programs out. And so what we did is we looked across a number of different intervention scales, going from 1,000 to 15,000 hectares. And what you're going to see as I flick through these is that there's going to be sort of colored pixels popping up, and each one of those correspond to a different type of practice that's being implemented on the landscape. And so initially you start to see some green and some blue, which correspond to cover crops and to riparian buffers coming in the middle, a few more buffers, starting to spread out, and at the end we start to get into some more controlled drainage, and these are going into tiled areas. And so this gives us sort of a scope of different scenarios that we can then look at and say, okay, well, what would actually the environmental outcome of implementing this type of a strategy really bring us? And to do that, I use a second spatially explicit modeling tool, which is called MESH, so Mapping Ecosystem Services to Human Wellbeing. And this is one that looks at the spatial distribution of the service provision in the watershed and assigns a value to each pixel. And it depends on the land covers that you put in. And so what we did is we ran this for each of those 6 different scenarios and compared it to the baseline of having no new agricultural practices put in place. And what that allows us to do is to look at how our ecosystem service provision is expected to change if we actually went ahead and put in any one of these scenarios of practices. And so what I'm showing you here is for the aggregate across these 6 different scenarios, going from 1,000 hectares to 15,000 hectares, and what the proportional change in the provision of an ecosystem service is expected to be across that whole watershed. And so you can't really see it, but there's a very slight negative impact on water quantity. So the minute you put in more riparian buffers and cover crops, you have more evapotranspiration, a little bit of the water's left the system. We also had a little bit of carbon sequestration and storage that was associated with the riparian buffers. But the biggest changes was really where we thought they should be, which was the change in the export of sediment and nutrients into the system. And so what you can see is that the brown bar is the amount of sediment exported, the yellow bar being the amount of phosphorus exported, and the orange nitrogen. And as you increase the scale, obviously we're getting a much larger impact in terms of how much we think that we're being able to retain on the fields rather than going into the water. Above each of these 2, you'll see a number, and these are numbers that my colleague Caroline has been working on, which is trying to figure out what would the cost of these interventions be on a 20-year time frame. So she's been looking at the total costs using a cost-benefit analysis approach to implementing these. And what we've used is a 20-year time frame because many of the ecosystem services we're talking about aren't realized the day after you put in a riparian buffer, that they happen, there are lags in the system, and so they might not actually be realized for that 20-year period either, or until that end of that 20-year period. And so some of these numbers look kind of feasible, $2.4 million. I can imagine that happening in 20 years. Other ones look much more challenging, $42 million. Is that really a possibility? And probably not, because that's an enormous scale of intervention. So as my colleague Vijay mentioned, in all of PEI, they managed to put in 4,000 hectares of riparian buffers and other agro-environmental changes. So that's probably something that might be more in line with what we're looking at. But to compare that, to give it some sort of scale, is that the Prime Vert program for the last 5 years has invested $42 million. And so it might not be out of the range of possibility to think that a large, important watershed like Baie-Missisquoi could see, $1 to $2 million a year for 20 years if the government was willing to make that kind of commitment. And so these are really preliminary results. We're working to improve them by trying to get more locally relevant efficiencies for a lot of these. We're relying on literature, and we're hoping to work with partners in Baie-Missisquoi and others to come up with better ways of representing these different practices in the watershed. and also incorporating other practices as well. So there's sort of no tillage, but we haven't explored, and we're also looking at precision agriculture. Can we represent those kind of options? Those are sort of like the forefront of where things are going. Can we bring that into the package of consideration? And so just some key messages I wanted to leave you with is that it's important that many of the programs we currently have to date are based on farmers being voluntarily coming forward and engaging. And it's not necessarily that they are creating the most of the problem or even all that involved, but they have a willingness to do it. And so that doesn't mean that there aren't other farmers in the landscape that also need to be brought in through some sort of a mechanism. And that these landscape level modeling tools can help us figure out where in landscapes some of these problem areas really do reside, and so we can start to target them. But just finally to remember that farming is a very individualistic practice, and that farmers have preferences and traditions that are well-founded, and they have value systems too that we have to engage with. We can't obviously, as some of us would like to do, including myself, just sort of top-down tell people what to do on their lands, that we have to find a way to engage them and understand the social values behind their decisions to try to bring them into programs and provide the right type of incentives to do that. So on that note, I'll just say thank you. I have an amazing lab to thank as well, and I'm glad you guys stayed right till the end.
Merci Sylvia. Peut-être une ou deux questions? Oui.
Surtout pour toi, c'est Jérôme ton prénom? Oui. Ce qui est très fascinant dans l'approche socio-économique, de ce que j'ai entendu à ce jour, il n'y a aucune mention à ce jour sur le coût des changements climatiques. Puis ultimement, peut-être en prenant en considération ce que Mère Nature est et ce qu'elle deviendra versus ces changements, je pense que fondamentalement, il y a un impact énorme sur le territoire, mais on ne contrôlera jamais ça. Et je pense que dans l'analyse et dans les hypothèses, je pense qu'il faut aussi considérer le coût des changements climatiques.
Oui, mais d'ailleurs, je pense Sylvia, là, avec...
Ouais. Mais avec les logiciels, l'un des avantages, c'est que tu peux simuler aussi le changement dans la prévision de l'intensité de la précipitation. Combien d'épisodes par année est-ce qu'on prévoit? C'est quoi l'intensité qui a un impact sur les apports de sédiments, nutriments? Alors ça, c'est aussi une autre dimension qu'on aimerait ajouter ici. On parle un peu avec Uranus pour voir si c'est possible d'avoir, est-ce qu'ils ont quelque chose qu'on pourrait utiliser pour intégrer dans nos logiciels pour bien représenter ces réalités, mais c'est vrai, absolument. Merci.
Je me demandais aussi quel type de données est-ce que le logiciel intègre par rapport à l'efficacité de l'enlèvement, par exemple, des nutriments dissous dans les bandes riveraines. C'est extrêmement variable. Quand on parle de bandes riveraines étroites, ça peut aller de 0% à 100%. Donc, comment tu fais pour gérer l'hétérogénéité des données quand tu intègres ça dans un modèle et te dire que ce modèle-là donne des résultats qui sont représentatifs pour une prise de décision à l'échelle du territoire? Oui,
c'est une très bonne question parce que, il y a beaucoup de... Pour le moment, j'ai pris des données qui étaient des méta-analyses qui regardaient comme à travers plusieurs études qui ont été faites pour donner une idée de ce qui se passe. Mais il y a manière de aussi répéter la même analyse plusieurs fois, mais en changeant l'efficacité, à voir est-ce que ça a réellement un impact important sur le choix de placement des pratiques. Et deuxièmement, c'est quoi le changement aussi en apport lorsqu'on fait la modélisation de l'apport des services. Et c'est un peu de faire un sensibility analysis à ça. Mais aussi, c'est de travailler avec des personnes dans le champ qui font les plus précises expériences possibles, de savoir, OK, et on a essayé de faire ça comme on a pris 3 différents types de peuplement pour les bandes riveraines, mais on pourrait essayer aussi de démontrer comme différents types de bandes riveraines aussi. Merci.
Dernière question, Albert.
Une des choses auxquelles je pense depuis quelque temps, c'est qu'il y a une possibilité qu'on n'arrive pas à changer la façon de faire de beaucoup de personnes. Alors, si on réussit à installer à l'intérieur du bassin versant, des sous-bassins versants, des espèces de petites stations d'épuration, genre des milieux humides intégrés à l'intérieur du cours d'eau, est-ce que des coûts comme ça, on peut regarder qu'est-ce que ça peut amener? Parce que j'ai l'impression que pour une partie de la population, faire des modifications importantes dans la façon de faire, qui ne sont pas nécessairement d'accord à faire ça à court terme. Du coup, faire quelque chose à l'intérieur du bassin versant, faire une station d'épuration à l'intérieur, ça peut avoir des effets beaucoup plus vite que faire des changements de mentalité et de l'implantation éventuelle volontaire pour faire des changements. C'est quelque chose qui... Le processus, comme ça fonctionne maintenant, c'est quelque chose qui est très, 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 très lent. Et là, tu penses plutôt à un top-down effet du style qu'on fait quelque chose dans le bassin versant et que ce qui se passe à l'intérieur des champs agricoles, on n'en parle pas trop.
Moi, j'ai de l'impression qu'on devrait faire les deux en même temps, réellement, pour avoir des impacts sur la qualité de l'eau. Si on fait des pratiques agro-environnementales seulement, il y a des délais dans le changement des systèmes qui sont assez longs. Peut-être on ne verrait pas vraiment une diminution dans le phosphore pour une période de 20, 50 années. Honnêtement, on ne sait pas. Et est-ce qu'on veut attendre? Et c'est aussi difficile de garder les personnes, leur intérêt pendant une période de temps où ils ne réalisent pas vraiment un changement. Alors, je pense qu'on doit penser de faire ces choses en parallèle parce qu'on veut un milieu agricole qui est plus diversifié, qui apporte des bénéfices, mais on ne veut pas attendre pour la qualité de l'eau. Alors, je pense que c'est possible. Moi, je ne sais pas pour la partie économique comment faire ça. Je pense que peut-être mes collègues dans le labo qui sont plus alignés dans cette discipline pourraient avoir des idées à comment faire ça.